Hi, everyone, and welcome to our annual Sloan Salon. I'm Ashley Flores. I'm the Fiction Programs Associate on the Artist Development team at Film Independent. For the last 30 years, our artist development programs have been at the forefront of educating, championing, and furthering the careers of filmmakers. And tonight, we're excited to continue educating with the 2024 Sloan Salon, Producing and Science, Developing Hollywood-Sized Stories Based on IP. We are proud to partner with the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which encourages artists to create more realistic and accurate stories about science and technology, as well as to challenge existing stereotypes about scientists in the media. Film Independent's long-standing collaboration with the Sloan Foundation includes a robust granting program to support qualifying projects. In short, we give out money. In fact, this past year alone, we awarded $120,000 in Sloan grants across our fiction programs, including the Episodic Lab, the Producing Lab, Fast Track, and a distribution grant for finished films. There's more information on the Film Independent website, and I'll also put a link in our chat, so please check it out. If you have any questions throughout, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them as best as we can. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our incredible moderator, Wendy Calhoun, a Peabody Award-winning television series writer and producer. Wendy's impressive career has allowed her to explore various realms of storytelling, including one-hour dramas, unscripted series, virtual reality, and gaming. Her drama credits include writing and producing the first season of Fox's Empire and debut seasons for The Rookie Feds, Prodigal Son, Station 19, Nashville, Revenge, and Justified. And she's been working on the Sloan Salon with us for 4 years now, right, Wendy? Without further ado, Wendy Calhoun.
Hi, everyone. Welcome today for another wonderful virtual Sloan event. I'm so happy to be back with you. I have some really cool things. We want to delve into the rewards and challenges of adapting stories based on science IP. Okay, usual topic for us, right? And we want to offer insights today that will help to bring Hollywood-sized stories to life while in maintaining scientific integrity and captivating audiences. You know, it can be science, but it can be entertaining too, right? I have the pleasure of introducing the panelists. So here we go. And I hope I don't have too much lag, you guys. I'm having some Zoom issues all day. So I think you can give me a thumbs up in the, if anyone noticed that I'm having some problems. Okay, I'll start with our feature filmmakers, and they're fearless filmmakers, and they're daring to tell stories. We've got Lisa Bruce with us. Hi, Lisa. Lisa began working as a film producer in 1992 when she and Robert Nicholson, Bruce's NYU professor, right, and mentor, formed a production company. And they produced films like Pen Pals, The Search for One-Eyed Jemmy, Bye Bye America, No Way Home. Later on, Lisa went on to co-produce the independent film Tumbleweeds, which won lots of awards. The Emperor's Club, A Lot Like Love, Fighting, Case 39, Arthur Newman, and she worked with HBO on some telefilms as well. Oh, getting into my TV box here. That included Walkout, the East LA Walkout story, and Mary and Martha, about two female malaria scientists. But you probably know the next title that Lisa is known for. She produced The Theory of Everything, a film about physicist Stephen Hawking's first marriage to Jane Wilde Hawking that was released in 2015. And that film was widely praised. It received 4 Academy Award nominations, 4 Golden Globe Awards, and 10 British Academy Awards. So I have a question for you. First of all, congratulations on your success, Lisa. And what would you say has been the most fascinating or rewarding aspect that you discovered while you were producing science-based narrative?
Well, I think the most rewarding thing about it has been figuring out how to translate from someone like, for example, like Stephen Hawking, whose mind is so intellectually beyond not just myself, and not just our director and not just our screenwriter, but kind of the whole crew and everybody. We all ended up obviously buying his famous book, and we also then went on to watch some of us bought the children's version of it so we could sort of understand it more. But I think I also learned a lot even from him, because at the time he was alive, and even though he would speak through a computer, we could engage with him on certain things, and obviously engage quite well with his ex-wife about things and his children. And it was really learning the process of how, even when you get to the point of going, oh, I kind of almost understand this, how you need to translate that in a film for a general audience. And that is incredible challenge. It's the ongoing challenge of how you make something so that it's still entertaining, and I would say at its core emotional, so that people can actually kind of grok it. It can actually go into them, as opposed to it being feel like a science lesson. And that was a really interesting challenge, and it remains interesting in anything I'm working on, just trying to take very, very dense intellectual material and fold it into a fictional story, which is representing real people in a way that is really something your general audience can actually get, so you're not alienating them.
That's pretty fascinating. I'm sure we'll circle back to that, as they like to say, because I think that's a challenge for everyone, especially anyone that's producing an original piece of content, right? That's not based on an IP, that's not based on a lot of research. That must be such a challenge. And so we'll get to talking about that. I want to introduce Jim Young. Welcome, Jim. This is a bit of a homecoming for you. Jim was part of Film Independence Producers Lab and received multiple grants from the Tribeca Film Institute and the Sloan Foundation. So welcome. Among Jim's productions, it includes the documentary Year of the Bull, the drama The Words, starring Bradley Cooper, Jeremy Irons, J.K. Simmons, Olivia Wilde, and Zoe Saldana, Lovely, starring Amanda Seyfried, Life of a King, starring Cuba Gooding Jr., The Man Who Knew Infinity, starring Dev Patel and Jeremy Irons. The Catcher Was a Spy, starring Paul Rudd, Paul Giamatti, Jeff Daniels, and Guy Pearce. And Cutthroat City, starring my friend Terrence Howard. And Elisa wait, I'm not going to say this right. Izia Gonzalez, am I saying that correctly?
Isa Gonzalez, yep.
Yeah, and Ethan Hawke. So Young recently produced a podcast, right? The Undercovers with Ed O'Neill and Ray Liotta, Westward with Jerry West for iHeartRadio, and The League of Richard Sherman and Taylor Rock, and Shadowball for Audible. I'm a huge Audible fan. Congratulations on that. He's a Producers Guild of America member and a founding member of the Producers Union. Jim, congratulations on your success as well. What would you say has been the most challenging aspect that you've discovered while producing your science-based work?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the first one that I did, I actually, Sloan has kind of helped us on two projects, Man Who Knew Infinity and Catcher Was a Spy. Both, one is a kind of a math-based project, which is Man Who Knew Infinity, and Catcher is about a spy during the Second World War who sort of quickly learned about physics and was basically sent on a mission to meet with Werner Heisenberg in Zurich and decide if where they were with the nuclear program in Nazi Germany. So Man Who Knew Infinity was the first one that I did. I was, like you said, I was in the producers lab with that project with Film Independent, and it's a movie that takes place during World War I. It's not a war movie though, obviously, and it's about a mathematician named Ramanujan who was a genius, but very little education. Sort of learned on his own reading mathematics books in the first part of the 20th century. And so, lead character is a Southern Indian character set in, 1912 to 1919. And, moving towards, he went to the UK to Cambridge and worked with some professors there at Trinity College. And so the project, was challenging in one sense of, it's a period movie with an Indian lead. It's a mathematics movie, which you're talking about like Hawking, somebody that's working at a level that's so beyond anybody else in that era and even probably today. And so, you have to sort of humanize that character. So that's a challenge in the sense of, one, explaining the math. And fortunately for us, we had Sloan backing us up to kind of help us get some of the, most brilliant mathematical kind of minds in the world. They were on set with us, helping us, writing on the chalkboards and doing all that kind of stuff that were really helping us kind of make sure that we didn't, sort of do anything incorrect as far as the formulas and so forth. But again, this movie was really challenging because, trying to raise the money for it, again, period, Indian, lead, and, mathematics, it was really challenging. And we got sort of people telling us, oh, well, I'll put money into it, but you have to put some Bollywood song and dance routines into the movie and sort of
Okay.
strange, bizarre kind of requests, throughout the process of raising the funding. So, we had a lot of crazy experiences in sort of putting it together, but so there were all kinds of different challenges, I'd say.
Wow. You know what I love is you've both described some of the films and the filmmaking things that you've been working on, and they're both science oriented, but neither of them are sci-fi per se, right? I mean, people kind of go to, it's got to be sci-fi if it's science, almost like in the same way, if it's an Indian movie, it's got to have Bollywood, So, wait a minute, there's so much more to talk about, which segues me into introducing our esteemed science panelists. I'm going to start with Dr. Rochelle Brooks. And she is, you should all know that she's an academic phenom. So we're going to all have to try to catch up. Okay. After working, well, you know what? Let me back that up with some data. She earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, an MFS in forensic science from Nebraska Wesleyan University, and a BS in chemistry from Northern Iowa University. Now, after working in a crime lab, which I've written many a crime lab thing, I'm already loving this, Dr. Burks returned to academia, teaching and forensic science research. An analytic chemist, he enjoyed the challenge of developing detection methods for various compounds. Okay. Her research team is focused on developing colorimetric and luminescent sensor arrays for detecting analytes. This is really good. Analytes of mainly forensics and national security interests with accompanying image and chemometric analysis. All right, you're going to have to boil that down for us. Dr. Burke's teams uses laptops, tablets, phones, and smartphones. Okay, these are all things we use for image collection and data processing to maximize the portability of their analytical systems. Now, before forensics and national security, there are a variety of films where low cost, rapid, reliable screening methods are needed. Now, beyond the lab, Dr. Burks is a popular science commentator, appearing on TV and podcasts and at large genre cons such as Dragon Con and Geek Girl Con. She also writes a science meets true crime column called Trace Analysis for Chemistry World, the Royal Society of Chemistry magazine. She's a member of several local, national, and international communities, task forces, and projects focused on social justice and STEM. Okay, Dr. Rochelle.
You did great, by the way. You did great. That's a lot of jargon. That's my faculty bio. I'm sorry about that. But basically shorthand, if you see me running, you should try to keep up.
Ooh, okay. Okay, that's main character energy right there.
I do
okay.
and
Question.
so run fast.
So, yeah, right? I'm going to get to coming back to asking you about the crime lab, that transition, which sounds fascinating to me. But I'm so curious. So what maybe were some things you saw in popular culture growing up as a kid, as a teen, and it kind of inspired you maybe to pursue a science career? Or maybe it wasn't that at all. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a parent. What inspired you?
No, it was absolutely pop culture. I mean, you would expect for me as a forensic person, I'm 49 years old. People might think like, oh, it's Quincy MD, which is a wild show, and I loved it, especially Sam. Or you might think like Agatha Christie, who I also adore, Murder, She Wrote. But actually, it's Night of the Living Dead.
What? Oh my
Um,
gosh, I'm sure we got lots of horror fans out here who are loving this right now.
so my parents are huge
Okay.
horror fans, huge sci-fi fans, and they thought it was a good idea to show it to a 5-year-old, man, which absolutely traumatized me. And I couldn't sleep. And so I ended up going to the library. My parents took me, and eventually, like going through all these science things and librarians, I'm like, oh, we would just die. Oh, okay. I was so relieved. Like all the pathogenesis and biochemistry and all, and like the relief of it, but also that really got me into the idea of, no, we can science this out. Like we can do this. There's a real issue there, but also kind of the backdrop of the metaphor of why was this movie made at this time. You kind of dig deeper into the zombie lore and the societal things. And I still have a love of zombie movies, but really that was it. It was absolute abject terror that pushed me kind of into that. And so I'm still a huge sci-fi horror fan, and I watch it in two minds of just being a hardcore fan. I love it. I love the wackiness of it, the the kind of all the sensory things. And at the same time, I'm like reviewer number 3 going, that's not how that works. But but I'm still having fun at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think I having that opportunity with my parents and having that type of cinema of, no matter how silly it is, a lot of scientists, right? It's Star Trek, it's whatever, but a lot of us too, it's comic books, it's graphic novels, it's horror, it's cartoons on Saturday that really spark our interest.
Wow. Okay. So note to self, things we do here in Hollywood actually create the next generation of scientists. You should know that.
Super villains, it's a fine line. So
Exactly. And then I would like to introduce Elena. Elena is a writer and historian of medicine, public health, and environment. She's the author of How to Sell a Poison. Ooh, this is a book I need. The Rise, Fall, and Toxic Return of DDP. Vaccine Nation, America's Changing Relationship with Immunization. And with Amy, you're going to have to help me with Amy's last name.
That's okay. With some other people.
Amy N. Okay. And with a group of other really great people, she wrote Pink and Blue, Gender, Culture, and the Health of Children. Elena's research focuses on scientific controversies, science denial, and the public understanding of science, and has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Institute of Health and National Library of Medicine, the Science History Institute. And she's an affiliate of Berkeley's History Department and Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, and the Department of Anthropology, History, and Social Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. And previously, she was a professor of history and a Mellon Fellow in Health and Humanities at Emory University, and an award-winning health columnist and reporter for the Los Angeles Times. So you've got a wide variety of expertise. We know this is true. And I'm gonna tick them off, you guys, because if you've got a question about this, you might want to send it into the chat eventually here. So what we have in our midst it's got expertise in the history of medicine, the history of public health, environmental history, US history, global health history, pesticides, vaccines, infectious diseases, epidemics, science communication, public understanding of science, measles, mumps, chickenpox, hepatitis B, HPV, smallpox, and polio. So you can see that's like 10 movies in you. There's so many narrative storylines that you have expertise in. I mean, the history alone. But I'm curious, having all this wide, kind of birth of knowledge, what scientific arenas do you think are underrepresented in Hollywood and are ripe for a new narrative?
This is such a good question, and I wish I had it like 10 days ago, not just 20 minutes ago. But one of the things that immediately jumped to mind when you asked me that question was that we have so many stories about scientific triumphs and also scientific controversies, but not so many stories about scientific failures. So I think like my number one answer to that question is like the failures are fascinating sometimes, the things that we tried to do and we got so wrong, and that we believed we had right for a really long time. I mean, just one little example of this was this whole mode of healing in the early 20th century where people just thought that you could cure anything with electricity. It was like we were, kind of like we're living in this moment now where we're going to solve all our problems with AI. Like, when things are new, we tend to go into that same exact mode of like, we are going to save the world with this new technology. And you name it in the past, we've kind of lived through those moments. So yeah, my first thought was like shifting away from scientific triumphs towards scientific failures and these kind of quirky things that we've done in the past and even in the present. My other kind of like second thought that jumped to mind was about the kinds of folks who were doing science and not getting any credit for it or being ignored. I'll give like two short examples. Just one that I read last week. I was opening a book written by a really prominent biologist in the 1960s. He wrote a whole bunch of really popular, influential books about human biology, infectious diseases, and I opened up one of them and I read the dedication to his wife, Eve, for being such a great companion, for typing the manuscript, for retyping the manuscript, for doing so much of the writing, and for coming up with so many of the ideas while raising their 5 children and traveling around the world. I was like, okay, so whose science was this, right? And there's stories like that could be found everywhere. Another story that I've been really interested in the last few years, which appears in part in How to Sell a Poison, is a story of a town in northeastern Alabama, which was one of these towns, like so many across the US, that was so heavily contaminated with chemicals, toxic chemicals, throughout from the 40s, 50s, 60s, through the 70s, 80s. And in this case, this town had a mayor who I think was one of the first Black mayors of Alabama. And he was also a scientist. He was a scientist by day for NASA, mayor at night, and kind of stumbled across the fact that his community had been poisoned with PCBs, DDT, other chemicals for decades. And so he kind of led this crusade to have his community tested and found that they had the highest levels in the world ever of some of these chemicals. So these are, in some cases, these are stories that have like a lot of inherent tragedy, a lot of layers to them, because they're stories that, and this is the last thing I'll say about kind of underrepresented stories in Hollywood, science that takes place in a context that's like so rich with like all of the struggles that all of us face, from like heartbreak and financial problems to racism and raising kids and all kinds of injustices. So setting science in those contexts, I think, is what brings science to life and also makes it really relatable.
Absolutely. I often tell people who are interested in Hollywood careers, especially screenwriters like me, that Hollywood's kind of the last stop on the creative train. Like typically you have a better success rate, I find, if you're not trying to completely create an original piece. There's value to IP, as we call it, right? So if you look at Oppenheimer, you look at Hidden Figures, you look at Lessons in Chemistry, and they're all based on another piece of work. And one of the reasons that that's actually a great tool for us who want to work in this particular arena is that years of research go into these books and the development of these books, and also the shaping of a narrative. It allows us to come in as filmmakers and just think in terms of the screenplay story. For Jim and Lisa, how important is IP in your development of your projects? And what advice do you have for people out there who are thinking, I'd like to find a piece of IP and develop it, or I found a book and develop it, and I don't even know how to start?
You want to start, Lisa?
Oh, sure. I don't know, Jim, if this has been your experience, but I find that studio execs that are in the position to greenlight something, to give it funding, are often secured by the idea that there's IP out there. It makes them sort of a arm's length from deciding whether something's worthy or not. That it sort of covers them, if you will, because if there's already a book out there or even a article from The Nation or an article in the New York Times or an article, frankly, anywhere that's been published in some major publication, it sort of gives them, it gives you as a producer pitching it a sort of validation stamp, and that people are already tracking it. There's a lot of things now being developed from podcasts, and because you can already then quote the amount of people listening and engaging with the podcast. And it doesn't have to be numbers that relate to a box office, but it just says that it's already something people are engaging in, interested in, and following. So IP really helps in that regard. It also helps, I think, in what you were bringing up, Wendy, is just that someone has already cooked some level of the stew. In the case of Theory of Everything, it's very different than the book. The book is not really about Stephen's science or Stephen's even as much about his brain power in that as it is his ex-wife writing about their domestic life. And what was just interesting about that, there had been a bunch of documentaries made about Stephen Hawking, so a lot of his science had already been exposed in some form of cinema. And what we were trying to do was just open up about the man, because that's also where I think science becomes interesting, because it becomes humanized. So many people, when I was pitching it, they thought he was American because of the electronic voice is an American voice. They thought that he was in a wheelchair from the beginning of his life. They just assumed that he was crippled from birth. Almost no one seemed to know that he was ever had a family. No one seemed to know he had children and that he was married. So it became this very interesting entry point in. Then you could have some of the science. And also it was just more about exposing the life of a crazy intellect. I mean, so intellectual, but the life was so human. And I think that allows people to see their way into science. And I'm sure that Sloan has records of this, but when movies like that come out, like our movie, they were tracking, people were tracking on how many more kids signed up for science, and that the applications for graduate programs all go up just because you've orientated people to science.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, for me, I mean, almost everything I do at this point is based on some sort of underlying intellectual property, and option a lot of books, a lot of nonfiction books, mostly nonfiction books, and/or life rights. And so, I've set up a few TV series and some other stuff at studios, and then have developed stuff independently as well. But you know, especially if you can get a book that has been sort of successful, whether it's a New York Times bestseller or things like that. Infinity was a New York Times bestseller. Catcher Was a Spy was a New York Times bestseller. Some of the books that I have optioned now that we've set up recently are based on that as well. So it's like a proof of concept in the sense of, the marketplace being receptive to the concept of that subject matter. But then on a sort of a more practical level, like you said, Wendy, Rob Cannagle, who wrote Man into Infinity, had done so much research and sort of studied this story of Ramanujan for so long that you got every bit of information you could get about him from just this one resource. And obviously we did other research as well, but it's sort of standing on the shoulders of the giants in terms of the writers, the authors of these books that kind of got us to the next level. Catcher was another one that was a project that had been optioned by a bunch of different people, including George Clooney, and was at Warner Brothers for 8 years. And my bread and butter is getting the books that were optioned once or twice or 3 times, a lot of times by Scott Rudin, who gets it before it even comes out. And then when they don't make it, after 2-3 years, I come in and say, look, I'm going to give you a lot less money than Scott Rudin paid you the first time around, but I'm going to get this thing made. And so we have a track record of sort of turning projects that seem to be somewhat unmakeable into actual movies. So
I love that. It's chasing Scott Rudin. Well, thank you for doing that, you know. So this one is for Elena or Michelle, either one or both. Um, I am so curious about one thing as a writer, which is I'm always trying to figure out some of the philosophical questions around my story. And when I think about science and the different arenas of science that you have both been a part of, are there philosophical questions that come up for you repeatedly where you think, God, that would make a great movie, or I haven't seen that in a movie, or I saw this movie that actually hit something and they were pretty accurate with the philosophical of it all?
Oh, I mean, I'm just laughing like in the Rolodex of my mind going through.
Go for it. Go for it.
I think, people would say, especially chemistry, oh, you're a hard physical scientist. And I'm like, I have a PhD. That is a philosophy doctorate. And there's a big part of the things that we discuss, and especially, being a forensic person at the intersection of the law and science, two things really shaped by culture. And some people are very uncomfortable with that, especially in sciences. We want like one corner that is not subject to our whims and our biases, and that's just not true. I mean, case in point, eugenics, right? And how many Milligan, fantastic chemist, absolute menace, as far as a eugenicist and what he did in California. And so like, and of course, Galton, like there's lots of people that you're like, yikes, but they are also considered parallel to that, right? These big founders in the field, right? So there are those types of stories where, and even with Oppenheimer, is that, but we're not talking about the Navajo and the displaced Hispanic families and the environmental impact. And we are talking about it, but at which stage, right? Everyone's like dazzled by the white savior or the great white genius a lot of the times, but where are the stories about, even in Hidden Figures, I'm like, what is Kevin Costner doing? God bless. But but even within that, is that like a selling point? I mean, there are lots of ones where in forensic science, you are oftentimes working in criminal justice. And we know, at least I think we do now in 2024. I mean, it's by executive order, it's deeply disparate in its application of who we call a criminal, what crimes we pursue, what resources, right? The missing and murdered Indigenous, how we investigate missing and murdered Black women in this country and girls. And because I work in that film, the decisions that you make about which cases get the full press, and even in movies, who's the right victim, right? The missing white girl syndrome that is really talked about. Because the work is influenced by that, we have to have those tough conversations, including in the laboratory, right? Or in the research. Why is this research getting so much money? Why is this case getting top budget line? And they're throwing everything at it, but yet not this other 1,000, right? You're grappling with those, and you peel back the layers and you start saying, well, it's because of all these things, right? But we don't sometimes have the training, because we're trained in chemistry, to grapple with what you're talking about is like it's philosophy, but that you're running an intersection of like, yikes, right? You have to talk about these science questions, but then you run head on, especially in the criminal justice system and environmental investigations and anything with the forensic bent, you run on to these systemic issues that can't really be ignored, but that oftentimes science will act like, oh, but it's about merit. It's about hard data. And you're like, yeah, but who got to design the experiment? Who got to ask the questions? Who got the money? Who gets to be there at the table making the decisions? Who got to say that it was appropriate to experiment on these children, these adults? Like all of those things that we grapple with and we're still grappling with. It is, I think, what I'm always scared about is, seeing the movies, especially in forensic sciences, sometimes you don't see the pause to say, this is bad. Like, we should not do this. And that's why I'm going to say this, Deep Blue Sea. Love that movie. And I love that movie because I think it has one of the honest scenes in it where the head scientist lady has revealed she has been absolutely unethical and put everyone in danger. And one of her colleagues says, you stupid, right? Like that level of frustration, anger, but also voicing a righteous, like, you have massively screwed us up because of your unethical pursuit of this genius, of this panacea, and really having someone check them. That's what our colleagues do. That's what we should be doing, is saying that, maybe in a bit more professional way. We have institutional review boards, but sometimes not. You are absolutely correct, Wendy. Sometimes you do just need to
I mean, that's good drama. What you're saying is great drama, the calling of a character on their moral compass in the
yeah.
middle of this work. And even what you were saying, Elena, earlier, which is about the number of failures. I mean, the truth is, in most screenplays, what we are writing is our hero failing again and again and again. So the fact that that's not really resonating means we might be missing the mark on what we need to be doing in more science stories.
Well, what I loved about Rachel, your answer was like, let's see the pause, because there's this really integral part of the scientific process that often gets sped up and sped past in science itself, never mind storytelling, which is should we be doing this? And if we do this, what are the benefits and what are the costs? And like, how far do we go in calculating and taking all of those into account? I'm really curious to see Deep Blue Sea. I've never seen it. Maybe I shouldn't admit to a movie I've not seen on a film panel, but I haven't seen it.
It's a gem. But what you just said is why I think scientists and many people still quote the line from Jurassic Park. You were so busy, and I'm going to get the exact dialogue wrong, so busy saying, could we? You didn't ask, should we?
That's it.
And
Yep.
those are the philosophical questions that I spend most of my day, like, those are the hard parts. The technical parts, sure, computation. No, it's that for me in my work is, but should we?
Yeah.
And I do agree. Hawking's word, the math, the quantum mechanics, dark matter, absolutely. Should we be building weapons? Right? Or what are we doing here? And that is, I would like to see, and there are great examples in television and great examples in movies of the struggle, the intense struggle and the tears and the regret. And I think Oppenheimer does capture that, of the deep-seated regret, in that, like, seconds in the eye, right? I would like to see more of that with even more modern things, because I think sometimes it's very comforting for people to be like, oh, well, that was back in the day, before we knew better. And I'm like, yikes.
Yeah. And I want to just throw in one last thing to that. Also, like, going beyond the hard sciences, like, we seem to have this pull toward, physics, maybe physics really kind of tops the list this year because of Oppenheimer, but also biology, the medical sciences, but it's some of the other realms of science which are grappling with these same questions, which get treated in Hollywood as non-scientific. I'm thinking about like behavioral science, from everything from like, how you treat like mental health in kids to like, what it takes to, I don't know, ensure that our education system is working, things that fall under the rubric of like behavioral science, psychology, social science, which are all still grappling with the same fundamental questions, but sometimes get treated as something different from science.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, I could break it down really basic. I can't name 5 films right now off the top of my head with scientists that look like either of you. And I should be able to. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just saying in an observational way. And as we move forward in telling stories, especially stories that are not necessarily historic, but in our time, we have many women scientists and we have many scientists of color. And so I'm looking forward to the day when my daughters can come to me and rattle off 5 hero characters or 5 villains even that are reflective of just this panel alone.
I will say that's what I love. I mean, for all the flack that we can all as forensic people throw at NCIS or CSI or whatever, you look at the demographics of those shows, the Abby Shudo, the entire cast of CSI Miami, which is my favorite and the wildest. And, how many women are in power positions, are doing their DNA analyst or the drug person. Abby Shudo can do anything. So, for as whatever those shows are, it's that part. I was like, hey, that's pretty good.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear you say that. That gives me some hope. that things are changing. I do feel like they are. It's a progressive, slow drip, but it is happening. Okay, I'm going to start folding in some questions from our chat and people that are joining us today. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. So this one is for Jim and Lisa, and it's from an anonymous attendee. So I don't know what this is going to be. Here we go. Can you share advice for how independent filmmakers might go about securing the rights for IP and approaching authors and scientists for life rights? Okay, Jim, how do you chase Scott Rudin?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, as a producer or as a writer or anybody, your job is always pitching, right? It's always some version of a pitch, whether it's, developing the project and then pitching it to financiers, pitching it to an actor to come sign on board to the project. But as far as going after the life to the rights to a book or something like that from the get-go, it's kind of so you have to be sort of fearless in the pursuit of the project. And I think what's important too is, don't just sort of read the front and the back covers of the book. You need to know what's in the book before you make the approach to an author. And a lot of times the rights are sort of controlled by the publisher, but many times it's controlled by the author of the book. And so there's a way, I think, to kind of make that approach to the author. Usually most authors, they'll have their own website for their it's theirname.com or whatever. You send them an email, you sort of express your love for the book, and you just sort of, and then say, I'd love to talk to you, I'd love to tell you why I think I'm the person to kind of bring this to to the world as a movie or as a TV show or whatever it is. And it's flattery, it's a mix of flattery mixed with convincing them that you're gonna stop at nothing to get this thing made. So that's always been my approach.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of just elaborate on that a little bit when you said, yeah, our whole life is pitching. I mean, I always say, in a way, the job of the producer is you're taking a bunch of, hot air and a lot of adjectives and a lot of excitement, a lot of passion, and you're trying to make something shaped into something that will ultimately be shot. And so a lot of it is the talking game in the beginning. And I would say about securing IP, especially if you're someone that's starting out and you're not Scott Rudin and you don't have the name, it's so great to go after old stuff. Don't go after the thing that Oprah just said is this greatest book ever, because the problem is you will be really frustrated because it'll be purchased, it'll be grabbed up by Hollywood. I think Jim's approach is great. You find that stuff that's been optioned 10 years ago and has been on someone's list for 10 years, but they're not making it. A lot of these big time Hollywood producers that have a lot of money and a lot of contacts, that you look, sometimes they've got 100 things in development. So the chances of them making one of those isn't actually that great. They're going to make one of them, but making most of them is very tiny. So going after old, unknown, even if it's 6, 7, 8 years old, I would stay away from the New York Times bestseller list unless you happen to have that kind of money. And I think that in the case of Theory of Everything, that was actually the screenwriter, Anthony McCarten, going and knocking, got a cheap train ticket, went to Jane's house, knocked on her door, and sort of did a whole song and dance about how he wanted to make her book into a movie and didn't really have the rights. When I met him, he basically had a shopping agreement. And then we spent a lot of time with Jane, years, getting her sort of involved in what it would mean to actually sign away those rights before you go to a funding source. Because when you do go to them, you do need to have the rights, or you need to have a relationship with the studio where they'll buy the rights for you. And that's usually because you've been working with them for a while. So it's a mixture, but if you really care about something, that love letter can mean a lot. And I think it is really great to go directly to the authors, because the publishing house will often care less about you.
Yeah, I'll jump in one more thing. This is not a science-based thing or a nonfiction book, but my wife is also a producer. Her name is Tatiana Kelly. She, first project she produced, she was in advertising in New York, and she had a friend that wrote a screenplay that ended up getting into the Sundance Screenwriters Lab. But it was based on a Israeli author's short story, a guy named Edgar Keret, who's very famous in Israel. And when he approached Edgar, he's a Croatian director, writer-director, had sort of had some success in Europe, but hadn't made an American film. And when he approached him, Edgar said, "Yeah, I would consider giving you the rights to this, but you have to write the script first and share the script with me, and then I'll consider giving you the rights to the short story." So he was ballsy enough to say, "All right, I love this. I want to make this into a movie." And he did it. He wrote the script. Edgar liked the script, and subsequently now he's done 2 more things with Edgar. But that's like the ultimate sort of like true belief in yourself, to basically spend 6 months writing a script in order to just maybe get the consideration to have something, let the author option it. So that's the extreme level of that.
Yes, and I don't know if you've gotten a chance to hear Cord Jefferson talk about how he got American Fiction, or the book that was behind American Fiction, but it's a similar story.
Oh,
where
is
he
it really?
had
Oh,
to-
yeah.
He had to put it out there. I think it's Percival Everett who wrote the book, and it was the same thing. It's that passion, right? It's the drive, and then making it really personal is important. So I have a question from someone listening today, and it's a really cool one. I like this. What's the most polite and effective way to cold call or email an expert or scientist who you'd want to consult on your idea or story? Oh, what's the way, Elena? Dr. Rochelle, well, how does someone reach out to you if they have questions or they want to delve into what you do?
I think a great resource in general, though, is the Science and Entertainment Exchange. I'm a part of that. And then they reach out, they try to match up expertise, and they will just kind of, go through that system. And I've consulted for them on all kinds of things, and it's been really fun. And you also then get folks that are ready to consult, and they understand what that means. It's not my job to be a dream killer. I'll be like, okay, well, let's see if we can make that work. So I would really kind of promote the exchange, because then you already, again, have the list of people who are enthusiastic about helping, who clearly have the time, right? Who are doing it for the love of it and the activity. So that would be like my number one top recommendation, is to utilize that service.
Yeah.
So I teach students how to do science writing, but usually nonfiction science writing. And this is really interesting because that sounds so effective. And I often am in the position of having students go out there and try to get science to talk to them who really don't want to talk to them. And so they have to figure out ways to encourage them to feel comfortable and to feel like it's worth their time. A couple of the things that there's a whole bunch of strategies that we talk about, but a couple of them that I'll mention now include, one, kind of going through their graduate students and finding a grad student to take out to lunch or take to coffee to learn as much as you can about the science from somebody who has a little bit more time on their hands, is going to be really flattered by the invitation, and will probably be really good at explaining things, and a person who can potentially open the door. Another thing that we talk about is going to conferences. And if you know where somebody is going to be presenting or talking about their work, finding out if you can actually intersect with them there, like hear them present and then follow up afterwards and say, like, I know that you're also working on all of these things, and I was here because I really wanted to connect with you about this other thing. And then the other thing that we do is just tell people to just hound folks, like, read a paper and come up with some really good questions about it, like that. Based on all of your research, they're going to be pretty likely to want to talk about an answer. And email, call, at a certain point you have to give up. But scientists are super busy, but they also in general love talking about their research. And if you can show that you know their research and you understand it and you're on top of it and you have fun questions about it, that's a great way to open the door too.
Yeah, I love all those suggestions. And I have to, full disclosure, I love the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So if you're not aware of it, it's part of the National Academy of Sciences. I will plug them as well because I've used them many times. And you reach out to them, you tell them what you're working on, and they're very good about connecting you to people who might be very helpful or want to help with your story, exactly what you were saying. But I do like the idea of I feel like there's a whole movie or TV series and just talking to the grad students. Like,
What I would want to say though is that they are not less busy. So yes,
That's fair enough, especially these things. Yeah. Yeah.
like having
Um,
flashbacks.
Well, my would be horrified if they knew I just said that. So
just to chime in too, of course, the other great resource is Sloan, and
Mhm.
they hooked us up with multiple mathematicians for the Man into Infinity, to the point that they gave us a number of grants on that project over the years, but they gave us another grant to just get one of the scientists over to England when we were shooting there, a guy named Ken Ono, who's a brilliant mathematician. He's at UVA now, but I think at the time, he was at Emory, but they brought out a scientist, a mathematician from Princeton and somebody out from Emory at the time. And they were incredibly helpful, to the point where not only were they like immensely helpful with the the sort of the math of it all, and sort of helping us make sure we didn't look like idiots with that element of it, but they actually ended up helping us even raise money downstream on the movie, as we were finishing the movie and we needed finishing funds. So they were so tapped into the world of mathematics and knowing people that had an interest in the subject matter that they helped. So Sloan has helped us in so many ways, and they have kind of at their fingertips so many different incredible academics and sort of scientists, mathematicians, etc. So they're invaluable for that as well. So
I'll just jump in with another recommendation. Another great one is professional societies. American Chemical Society, which I'm a member and on in governance for, literally emailed directly to them. Donna Nelson, who was the advisor for Breaking Bad, used to be president of ACS. There's a lot of consultants in that, but they are also very eager to help. They have a whole component of their own. And so AGU, the Geophysical Society, the various all of them will be able to connect you. And they, that is in community engagement to them. So they are the right people, and they love to match up folks with that. And they really do want to hear from folks. They're always like, how do we get tapped in? So it's an underutilized resource.
yeah, they have those media offices that journalists use all the time, but I get the sense that it's mostly journalists, not necessarily people from the entertainment industry.
Right. Lisa brought up something great when we were just right after I introduced her, which was about how so much of the writing of scientific kind of content requires you to take vast amounts of information, complex information, and distill it for an audience that may know nothing about this. Elena, I'd love for you to speak about this, because as a journalist, it feels like that's got to be part of your process all the time, right?
Yeah. I guess I'll answer that in maybe two brief ways, because we could talk about it all night and I spend entire semesters on it.
Oh, wow.
But one thing that I usually direct people to is to start with one publication. So scientists often carry out their research and then put it out in the world through publications that are peer reviewed. Other scientists look at them. They're accessible through the scientific literature. And if you start with one publication, you usually can see the team of scientists who were behind it telling a story. Like, what's the background? Why did they ask these questions? What methods did they turn to answer these questions? what were their results, and then what are the implications of their results. So they kind of tell you all the pieces of the story, even though they're not putting it in narrative format, they're giving you lots of pieces in this one document, the published study. And then in the references, you'll see essentially their conversation with all the other scientists that they're talking to, reading, listening to, looking at for inspiration, for understanding of specific aspects of what they're doing. So I often advise my students to kind of start with one particular study and think of it as a story, and then find something in that study that piques your interest. It might be in the background section. It might be in the methods section, like they did what? They got how many kids? And how did they get their sputum samples? Like what, or it's in the discussion where, scientists sometimes go pretty far in thinking about the implications of their findings. So if I had to say in a nutshell, a good way of doing it, it would be start with that one study. If you're lucky enough that you can find a press release on it, go and read the press release. If you're lucky enough that there is a corresponding author listed on the study, just drop them a line. They're the people who are there and have volunteered to talk about their work. And they're the ones who can kind of help you break it down into its component parts, understand why they asked the questions they did, and they can also break down the significance of their findings.
Be sure to ask them the twist.
What's that?
There's always a twist in the story. There was a great hashtag several years ago called hashtag overly honest methods, where why were certain decisions made? We ran out of money. So-and-so spilled this into whatever. The car broke down and this is the field we ended up going to. Like whatever, like what was the twist? And sometimes because you're not an expert, this happens to me all the time when I'm reading outside my field, I don't know enough about it to know what is that wild, like what was the twist in the moment, the thing. There's always a twist. There's always a twist. So just say, what was the twist? What was the unexpected thing? And then that will lead you down to the real gossip.
Yeah. Oh man, that's exactly what we talk about in writer's room, by the way. Whenever we got to work on an act out in television, it's like, okay, what's the twist? Like we're constantly looking for those moments. So it's great advice. Lisa, I have a question for you. I'm just so curious. How important is it for you when you are working on one of your films or a screenplay, or even just, in the early development stages, how important is scientific accuracy versus, fictional account? And sort of how do you sort of draw that line, if you will, or do you draw the line? Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
I definitely draw the line because I think you really do need to be accurate enough. I mean, I was laughing when Jim said someone to write on the chalkboards, when we were making Theory of Everything. It's like you're just the production design, everybody's just thinking, okay, we'll put some stuff up there, and then immediately we're like, well, we can't do that because that's when people are going to zoom in on, everybody has, they're going to play it on their computer, on a DVD, they can stop and frame it, and so you have to have all that stuff be correct, because half of your audience, or even if it's 10% of your audience, that's where people will slam you, but also they kind of should slam you, like what you couldn't take time. So we had, all these physicists would come in and they would rotate to do the writings on the board so that it would be real, and it would be something that tied to the time and the discoveries of the time. And I think where I always go with this kind of thing is you get as deep and real and truthful as you can on the science for a particular scene. And then sometimes when the science is bubbling over and taking over and you're losing the emotion and the drive of the characters, that's when you might change the scene, but you don't change the truth of it, right? So you might lessen how deep you're going, but what you are talking about is something I think that has to be scientifically just bona fide.
I'm just talking because I'm fascinated. Okay, I'm curious. So when you approach a piece of material, what usually grabs you first? Is it the subject matter or the characters, or kind of what's one of your real hooks?
Are you, sorry, you asking it to me?
Yes, Lisa.
Oh, sorry, because you're muted for a second. I didn't hear.
Sorry.
It definitely the characters and or the predicament of the character. Like I mean, here's the thing I want to say about film and anybody out there thinking they want to make the film based in science and imagine based in science is that the thing about cinema and movies and television in general, I'm sure Wendy, you know this from all your struggles as a writer, when you're just writing this stuff, cinema, unlike a book and unlike a novel, is profoundly emotional and visual. So when you, that's why everybody will say, oh, I like the book better. I get it. Because in the book, they can go denser and you can imagine the characters. You didn't imagine it being Reese Witherspoon or whatever. And, you know, when you made it, you did. So I think that the thing to think about when you're making something visual like movies is that they in a way are simpler. They need to be simpler because the way you're going to pull people in and the way we're going to remember it is largely from emotion and what happened in it. It's if it's very, very plot driven, I don't think it ultimately becomes something particularly memorable. I think it's memorable because of what the character goes through and the change in the character.
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
Born Identity, not Science, but Born Identity had all been, you know, the plot and him trying to save himself, but it was fascinating to be watching a character who had no idea how he had these skills, had no memory of it, and then was living in his own kind of nightmarish puzzle. That became a very compelling thing to watch. Plus all the action's cool, but you know what I mean? It's a big, big difference. And so it's always, for me, it's always character and what they're going through and how they change.
Very true. I've been trying to see at least one movie in the theater a week for the last 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
And I have to tell you, so far, my favorite movie this summer has been Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And this is not my demo. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is so much, but I find it fascinating. And here are characters who are, not even, quote unquote, human, if you will. But I felt that the visual is incredible, the emotion is there, and the plot is fairly simple. So I co-sign everything you said, Lisa. Jim, I'm so curious too on your side. Science, fact, fiction, how do you feel about it when you're approaching your film?
Well, first of all, I come from a family of scientists. My father's a molecular biologist. My sister studied marine biology. My mom's a teacher, but I was never. I sort of went a different way, and like I said, I was a journalism major, and then I ended up, uh, getting into film. And as far as the science fiction of it all, I like sort of the big ones, the Star Wars kind of stuff and those sorts of things. But I really get fascinated by these, true story of these people doing interesting things with science or math, and something that Lisa was just talking about. Man of Infinity. I was fascinated by that story not because of the fact that this guy was a genius working on a totally different level than anybody else in the history of humanity. What I found fascinating about him was that he came from nothing. He had no formal education whatsoever, just was literally doing anything he could to sort of pick up books that he could find in a library or whatever and read these things and take in the information himself. But then what's even more interesting to me about it is the fact that he was, devout Brahmin Hindu. And, he goes into a world at Trinity College with basically a lot of atheists in terms of the academia of it all. And this guy, was as sort of devout to his theorems and the things that he was working on with his work as he was to his God. And it actually, from a kind of a narrative perspective and his actual life, it really, hurt him because he ended up getting sick with tuberculosis while he was there, and he couldn't eat anything. He was strict vegetarian because he was Brahmin, And so he just got sicker and sicker and sicker in the process. So as he's not only kind of dealing with, the kind of the crushing sort of rigor of academia, and them telling him, you can't just come up with these ideas, you got to prove it with your, with your work. So he's dealing with that. Then he's dealing with, trying to stay faithful in a very kind of unreligious kind of community. And then on top of that, he's dealing with racism. He's being attacked for being not Anglo in that place. So as much as the kind of the his genius and that element of his story was interesting to me, all the other things that went into it and what he accomplished with all these strikes against him in a way, what was the thing that was sort of interesting to me in terms of telling that story?
That's fascinating stuff too. I love how you described all the different levels of conflict that were affecting that character, and speaking of going to see movies every week, one that I saw this summer already was at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. They did a screening of E.T. and I hadn't seen E.T. since I was a child, and I was pretty blown away because there's very little dialogue in the film, but it is dealing with scientific subjects. And it's actually not dealing with, you don't really see scientists in sort of some of the usual places, right? Like they're, a professor, or they're in a lab, or, if it's CBS, they're surrounded by computer screens, whatever. But like, you know what I mean? It was a very different look at science. I'm so curious, especially for our scientists, because you probably have a good spidey sense for this. Have there been other stories that you've seen of late, or even, I mean, it could be any time, where you said, that's a science movie, but it's probably not what people look at and say, oh, that's a science movie. Do you know what I mean? Rachel's laughing. Are you?
Yeah, so I mean, what I think of a science movie, like when you mentioned E.T., I was like, man, Spielberg does that all the time. He's always putting scientists in wild, like go chase the shark, you go steal this antiquities thing and put it in a museum. But
Scientists in the wild. I like that.
it's gonna sound weird, but I would say the Meg and the sequel, because you're like this idea of this megalodon.
Right.
And then like the physics of it, but the evolution of it, but where it is spatially, like, so the things that sometimes I think are science movies is definitely influenced from my childhood, right? So I think of like all the great, like The Walking Dead.
Right.
So much great chemistry in that. Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. I mean, wildfire, all the poisons, like, so I kind of think of it in that, in those terms. But I think of any big monster movie or reanimation, I'm like, ooh, science movie. And there's usually a scientist behind, or some catastrophe. If it's like, what did we do? Because I'm just like peeling back which scientist in which military lab, or which went rogue, which supervillain scientist, or thought they were doing the right thing. Like, who, I'm just waiting for that person to show up, and I'm gonna be like, yes. And then there's another scientist that will come along and be like, you did a bad thing and now we got to fix it. Like, so I love that.
Yes, I have to tell you, I am going to go see Twister. I will see it in the movie theater, and I want to see who is that in Twister. You know what I mean?
And the thing I love about it is, I'm sure Elena will say this, is like the idea of how they do field research, the absolute no adherence to any kind of ethical constraints. They're putting everybody at risk. You sometimes watch it and go, yikes.
Yes, yes. Any thoughts on that, Elena? Just curious.
It's funny because you asked the question, and all I could think of were movies where it's like so obviously like the scientist pursuing their science. And I too tend to think in terms of like movies that really influenced me when I was younger, like Indiana Jones, which you were indicating. And I thought the funny one that jumped to my mind was The Day After Tomorrow, just like the science film that like picks up on a theme before we've really all gotten there, like
Yeah.
Oh yeah, climate disaster. Like, 20 years ago, we weren't really thinking about it Hollywood was. Like, it was kind of like pushing us further than we had gotten. And science fiction tends to do that. And I feel like the science fiction films that get the most credit for that are like the super like high tech space, or like, I don't know, like I don't know, Jetsons kind of science fiction sort of movies, or The Matrix or whatnot. But you know, The Day After Tomorrow took like, you know, environmental problem leading to like Armageddon, and like, you know, put it on the map really before the rest of us did.
That's interesting you just said that, because we do have a question. Can you speak to the decision to include climate change or not in modern films? It seems that in most modern settings, it isn't present. But I think the person feels like we're all kind of in the middle of it. How could you not acknowledge it? Have you noticed that? And are there any other pieces of science where you go, you know, this is all around us, but we're not talking about it? I'm specifically thinking, Dr. Rochelle, about all of the technology that you mentioned that you do work in, right? Using laptops and tablets and phones, which are a part of our lives.
Well, I mean, a tricorder is a smartphone, right? I even have that like signed off as like all that kind of thing of, you know, my smartphones, you know, is the tricorder of the modern, and there's a whole kind of field of smartphone science where you're doing really advanced diagnostic work for public health, field hospitals, forensic work. And in some ways, there's a bit of a catch up to kind of the prediction that we'd have a handheld, you know, spectrophotometer or handheld device that is that like, you know, and we're there, right? In a lot of ways. And so that part is really exciting to kind of almost be like, we have achieved it in some form, not perfect. So that would be definitely kind of one connection that I'm like, it's finally happened after when was Star Trek 60?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a whole generation now that have grown up with smartphones. It's just a part of it's not even a question, it's a part of their lives.
Yeah.
But I'll go back to climate change because I don't want to rush by it. Elena, any thoughts on that?
So it's such an interesting question, because I am racking my brain and I can't really come up with any depictions of it in recent television or film. Somebody else here probably can. I mean, it's all over our news media, whatever your news consumption looks like, it's just saturated with a climate focus of one kind or another, I feel like. And maybe it's because it's too real that it doesn't really form the stuff of our escapism pursuits, our escapist pursuits. I'm really intrigued by that question, because I hadn't noticed the pattern until the questioner pointed it out. And now I feel like, oh, I think they're right. I think they're onto something.
I think it's interesting though, like I'm wondering what will come next as far as the reach now, right, of climate change and infecting climate migration. And not just of human beings, but of disease and of predators and of insects and of molds. And all kinds of which you can write. There's 19 horror movies right there. But also the idea of limited resources. Like there's tons of research, including in forensics journals, as far as when it comes to like food crimes, food forensics, which is a fantastic area. But the idea of, you know, your olive oil, your maple syrup, your honey, your Prosecco, kiss it goodbye. Is it fake? Is it real? Like there's that whole dynamic, but also climate change and wine, like chocolate, coffee. Yeah, good luck. Right. And so I'm wondering, like, if is it being presented like it's in the background? We're talking about supply chain issue. Like it's so far in the background, you're like, guess who, like the big reveal of like the Wizard of Oz. Like it's really the real villain is climate change. Like that's why you don't have coffee anymore. Like, so I'm wondering if that will, because we're seeing those types of conversations definitely even in kind of podcasts and kind of coverage as far as, oh, you peel back the layers far enough and you realize it's climate change. And so I'm just wondering if that's coming, like on the next wave of it's going to be integrated into more scripts.
Well, we have a really, really smart group of people watching this. And so they're feeding me all kinds of examples right now. Extrapolations, I guess it's on Apple TV Plus. And it's about climate change. And they're telling me that Meryl Streep voices the last whale. So I think that's worth us checking out.
That one is all, that whole series is about the horror of climate change. It's actually quite entertaining, but it is, and downsizing. Alexander Payne made that. That was a whole thing, like shrink everything down because we don't have any more. And then don't look, I mean, look up.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Don't look up. Yeah, yeah.
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 But also, I think that comment that was being made, which is true, is that you don't, sometimes when you're trying to pitch movies, the sort of the last thing that Hollywood wants to make in a way is the thing that's, I think it's living in all of our minds. If you're awake at all, it's living in all of our minds all the time. And there's pressure, I will say, to create a certain level of escapism. It doesn't mean you can't, that the studios certainly have made many dark things and are funding dark shows and dark series, but there is a certain level of how much of that kind of entertainment would they fund, right? We're constantly dealing with it on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I mean, that brings up a great question too for you, Lisa and Jim. When you're going about the process of developing the pitches that you got to go then take into, the executive suite. Now it's all done by Zoom, but in those ways, like, well, I mean, how do you like to approach your pitch? At what point do you even go into some of maybe the scientific background of what you're saying, or do you? I mean, is there a method to your madness when it comes to that?
Jim, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, for me, look, one, you want to at least know enough to not look like a fool if they ask you a follow-up question, because there are a lot of really smart executives in the studios and the streamers and so forth, the Harvard and Yale educated folks that might actually have an interest in that piece of it. But, for me, again, not being sort of, necessarily a scientific mind, and especially for my, my screenwriters and things that, again, are coming from a writing background, less so than the scientific background. You want to lead with, obviously, the sort of the story and the kind of the character arc for your lead character and so forth. So, you want to make it compelling, emotionally and sort of dramatically, while still knowing enough that you don't look like a buffoon if somebody asks you questions in the Q&A section of the pitch. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think look, here's something I've said to some people that have pitched me stuff to see if I want to produce it, and it'll be based on something super important and very dense, and they've done a bunch of research. But if it feels like homework to me, like to watch it, like that feels like I should watch that. It's important, but it feels like homework. Like you kind of have to think of that, because it's very expensive to make most movies and most series at any level. I mean, you don't have to be at a Game of Thrones level, but when you're making series, are typically in these drama series, you're anywhere from 2 to 3 million per episode, all the way up to 20 million per episode, right? Per episode. So it's like when they're making a 10 episode series for you to click on from your flat screen, and everybody always says, oh, it's so expensive to have all these streaming services. I'm like, wow, you get to click on a $200 million thing for your $14 a month or something. I mean, there's really an amazing amount of work that goes into these shows and these movies. And so for me, it's if it feels like that's that kind of the last thing I'll watch, and I have to vote on the awards run. And sometimes when something's very heavy and it's historical and I know it's important, but it's kind of the last thing I go to. But I would want to add to that there are some really smart screenwriters and really smart producers where you shift the point of view. So maybe you can take something that's very heavy or something we wouldn't normally want to watch, but bring it in from a different point of view. You could pitch Breaking Bad like, oh, so a guy finds out, that he's dying, and he's a chemistry teacher in a high school, and the kids don't really care about what he teaches, and so he doesn't have enough money for his family, so he's going to go and he's gonna get into his little dip into the drugs world. But when you listen to that screenwriter, he's like chemistry teacher in high school, super boring, seemingly, right? That's what we would think. So I can't start that series, he says, with the guy lecturing in the chemistry class. I'll start with him, naked in the desert, flipping out. And how did he get here? Or how did he end up in his underwear in the middle of the desert? And now everyone's going to go, I have no idea what this is about, but this is great. And now you can go back and watch him teaching chemistry class, and you're like kind of on the edge of your seat in a way. So it's so much how you enter these stories and the point of view and the tone. Another huge thing is the tone, which they'll just endlessly ask you about, right?
Yes, yes. If someone mentioned in the chat The Imitation Game, and I have to tell you, I'm a fan of that film. And again, it's one of those things where I think it was, I'm a hopeless romantic, and there's a love story. There's actually several love stories buried in that I found fascinating. And then also just the whole idea that here's this man who gave his life to this science, who is credited with helping stop the Second World War. And yet the same government he tried to protect came to take away his life in many ways, because of his sexuality. I found that film to be very fascinating on multiple levels. But like you say, it wasn't just me watching people solve puzzles. That was a part of it, but they actually kind of made it fun.
Well, Oppenheimer is another one, which, again, it's so dense, and, it's a very long movie, and, a lot of the stuff they're talking about, to be perfectly honest, I'll make myself look stupid, but it was just way over my head. But it was so compelling the way he was able to kind of, Chris Nolan was able to kind of make it digestible for, a large segment of the population in terms of the science element of it. But then again, it's about him and his struggles, both with his relationships with women, and his dynamics with some of his colleagues. And so the drama kind of got audiences. I mean, the movie made, I don't know how much, over $1 billion, I think, which you would think, a movie about a physicist, a bunch of physicists out in the desert, you wouldn't think that it would be as successful as it was, but it was an incredible movie and so compelling. So it was a matter of kind of adding those layers to it to make the science kind of digestible to a broad public, I think.
And I am not a screenwriter producer, but I would say sometimes when I do consulting, I'm like, is it really key that they understand the science?
Yeah.
Or you want to get it correct, and I get that.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like, certain terminology, we can't actually use certain words, but it's like, because the story seems like it's actually more about these two about to fight. And so I think, like, I have asked people, I'm like, is it really key? Because I can give you the technical jargon, they can say it. Does it actually need to be broken down? And I think sometimes, I mean, I have watched stuff that, in a lot of different fields. I'm a huge sports fan, but they're like cricket. I've watched some great cricket related stuff, and I'm just like, it's not, make it make sense. But yet, but I don't need to know it because it's about the conflict. It's about like a certain underdog. I don't actually need to understand the ins and outs of cricket. And I think in some ways, I think, I always say, is that really key? I'm not trying to do their job for them, but I'm just like, which version do you want me to give you? Then you can just move on. And keep it moving.
We will also really go with it without even things that are preposterous. We will go with if we're emotionally connected to the movie. In E.T. at the very end, those kids have to, someone else will know this thing, but I listened to John Williams the other day, who's the composer, on a podcast, and he said, yeah, so at the end, they got to break the sound barrier or something on their bikes. They got to get away from the gravitational pull 17,000 miles a second or a minute, I don't know. And he said, but nobody says
We're
that.
crying
And
our eyes out.
you don't need to know that. We're just like, go, keep
Yeah.
going, don't keep him in the basket, because again, emotionally, they've brought you there. The filmmaker has brought you there, and the kids have brought you there, and now you're just rooting for it. So I do think you're really right. It's a really good point you're making, Michelle, because do we need to dive into that? That some of the best sci-fi movies, I mean, 2001, there's a lot of wonderful stuff in that. But I kind of go, and now you reflect on it when the AI is speaking to the guy going, I can't do that, Dave. Like how that's like what we're talking about now with AI. And that was how many years ago? 2001, 30, 25, I don't know, forever ago. So it's interesting to me how much you can bring us along without dropping into great dense detail.
And for me, just one tiny point on that, sometimes it's just if the storyteller knows the detail, it gives the story a bit more fidelity. Like, you know, yes, you're rooting for the kid. They have to be going the right speed, right? Like, and it never has to be said out loud, but it has to be baked deep into the writing so that the whole scene feels true to like as many viewers as possible.
Yes, I love what you were saying about the music and John Williams, because Oppenheimer to me was the soundtrack. I actually listened to the soundtrack again and again and again because it really helped me along emotionally with the film, because there was a lot, like you said, I didn't understand, but I could feel it, and what was coming through the music was really guiding me. So I appreciated that a lot about that film. So we're wrapping up. We only have a few seconds left. We have one question that I'm just gonna go ahead and answer it and go for it. So this person asks, how does someone get into science story producing from ground zero as a high school student? Okay, here's my tip for you. Make TikTok videos and show them to your friends and get their response and their feedback, and you are already on your way. And I can say, for me, one of the big things I've been learning, and I've been writing television for a very long time, but I keep digesting it into small bits. I break it down into a minute, into 3 minutes, into 5 minutes, and I try to tell it, how much story can I tell in a minute? And I think that is a kind of a way that the wave of storytelling is going. And if you can start to master it minute by minute, you will be on your way. That's my advice.
That's a great answer.
Oh, good. I don't want to lead anyone astray, but
I just want to recommend a couple of people if you're like,
Yeah.
oh, what would that look like? One would be Dr. Andre Isaacs, which is Dr. Dre 4000 on TikTok, is a great one. There's a great marine biology person called Sophistication Fish.
Yes, okay.
Marine science. And then there is a James Byrd Award winning forager, black forager, that really gets into like the science of like, don't eat that mushroom, you will die. Like, so there's those three, just absolute brilliance, and really the whole narrative arc, you're like, so that would be my recommendation.
Oh, I love that too. That's great. So not only can you make for TikTok, but you can go there to see what other people who are making science-based stories are doing. And they don't need anyone's permission. They certainly don't need Hollywood's permission. And I think that's the new age that we're in. So it's 7:01. We're already a minute over. I want to thank you all for coming. I get the pleasure of saying thank you and good night to everybody. And this has been so enlightening for me. I really enjoyed it. So I hope you did too.
Super. Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thanks.
Bye.